The reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window showed a perfect Manhattan couple, but Lucas watched the way his wife's fingers grazed another man's sleeve, a touch far too tender for a business dinner. It wasn't the betrayal itself that shattered the world, but the realization that she had already made her choice long before tonight, leaving him living in a marriage that was nothing more than a ghost. Beneath the clinking of crystal glasses and polite laughter, a devastating silence was about to descend, marking the beginning of an end no one saw coming. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet, heartbreaking moments that change lives forever, stay with me as we unravel what happens after the door closes. The gala was held on the 45th floor of a midtown skyscraper, a glass box suspended in the night sky, offering a panoramic view of Manhattan that justified the $1,000-a-plate entry fee. Inside, the air was conditioned to a crisp chill, scented with expensive perfume and the faint, metallic tang of chilled oysters. Lucas Bennett stood near a pillar wrapped in velvet, nursing a tumbler of sparkling water. He wasn't drinking tonight. He needed his senses sharp. From his vantage point, he watched the room swirl, a kaleidoscope of black tuxedos and designer gowns, but his focus was singular. It was fixed on his wife, Elena. Elena was radiant in emerald silk, her laughter carrying over the ambient jazz like a silver bell. She was the center of attention, holding court with a group of investors. Standing slightly too close to her was Julian Thorne. To the casual observer, they were just two professionals discussing market trends. But Lucas was not a casual observer. He was the man who had memorized the map of Elena's body and soul over 7 years of marriage. He saw what others missed. He saw the way Julian's hand rested on the small of Elena's back. Possessive, familiar, anchored. He saw the way Elena didn't flinch or step away, but leaned imperceptibly into the touch, her body softening in a way it hadn't for Lucas in months. She's glowing, Lucas thought, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. But she's not glowing for me. Lucas, darling, you're hiding. The voice startled him. It was Clara, one of Elena's colleagues, holding a champagne flute loosely in her fingers. Her eyes darted from him to where Elena stood with Julian, a flicker of pity passing through her gaze before she masked it with a bright smile. Just admiring the view, Clara, Lucas said, his voice steady. He was an architect. He knew how to build structures that could withstand pressure. He kept his face neutral, a smooth facade. It is breathtaking, Clara agreed, though she wasn't looking at the window. Elena is certainly networking hard tonight. Julian is quite the key to the new merger. He seems to be, Lucas replied. At that moment, across the room, Julian whispered something into Elena's ear. It wasn't a business whisper. Elena threw her head back and laughed, her hand coming up to touch Julian's forearm, lingering there, her fingers tracing the fabric of his suit. It was a gesture of intimacy that stripped Lucas of his breath. It was the same way she used to touch him when they were dating, when the world was just the two of them in a small Brooklyn walk-up. The connection between them was a live wire, crackling and visible to anyone who dared to look closely. Lucas looked down at his phone. No messages. Just the wallpaper photo of him and Elena from a trip to Napa 2 years ago. They looked happy then. But looking at it now, he wondered if he had been the only one smiling. He watched them for another hour. He watched the stolen glances. He watched them coordinate their movements, drifting toward the terrace doors separately, only to meet in the shadows of the balcony. Lucas didn't follow them. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was happening in the dark. The realization didn't come with rage, but with a profound, suffocating exhaustion. The woman in the emerald dress was his wife on paper, but in spirit, She had already packed her bags. He set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray. The condensation was cold against his fingertips. He checked his watch. 10:45 p.m. He walked over to the coat check, retrieved his trench coat, and stepped out into the cool October night. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't send a text. As he hailed a cab, he looked up at the 45th floor one last time. I am a ghost, he thought as the taxi merged into the river of red taillights. And it is time I disappeared. The Saturday morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of the master bedroom, casting long, pale shadows across the duvet. It was a cold light, devoid of warmth, much like the conversation happening in the room. Elena was packing a weekend bag, not her usual oversized luggage, but a sleek leather holdall, the kind meant for quick getaways and intimate spaces. She moved with a frenetic energy, folding silk blouses and selecting lingerie that Lucas hadn't seen in years. It's just a retreat, Lucas, she said, her back to him as she checked her reflection in the vanity mirror. She applied a shade of lipstick that was slightly too red for a business retreat. The PR team needs to brainstorm for the Q4 launch. No reception, probably. So don't worry if I don't answer. Lucas stood in the doorway, holding a mug of black coffee. The ceramic was hot against his palms, the only grounding sensation in a world that felt increasingly surreal. He watched her lie. It was a flawless performance, practiced and polished, but he saw the microscopic tremors in her hands. He saw the way she avoided meeting his eyes in the mirror. Sounds intense, Lucas said. His voice was even, stripping away any accusation. Have a safe trip, Elle. She finally turned, surprised by his ease. For a second, a flicker of guilt crossed her face. A ghost of the woman she used to be, but she quickly suppressed it. She walked over and pecked him on the cheek. Her perfume was overwhelming. It wasn't her usual scent. It was something muskier, heavier, something meant for another man's nose. I'll see you Monday, she said. Goodbye, Elena, he replied. He didn't say, see you. The front door clicked shut. The lock engaged. The sound echoed through the sprawling penthouse, signaling the start of the countdown. Lucas didn't move for a long time. He finished his coffee, washed the mug, and dried it carefully. Then, he went to work. He didn't tear the house apart. He was an architect. He understood that deconstruction required as much precision as construction. He went to his study and packed his drafting tools, the compass, the scales, the heavy sketchbooks filled with designs for houses he had dreamed of building for them. He packed his clothes, selecting only the essentials, leaving behind the expensive suits Elena had bought him to mold him into the power husband image she craved. 2 suitcases. That was all 7 years of his life amounted to. He walked through the apartment one last time. He touched the leather sofa where they had watched movies on rainy Sundays. He looked at the dining table where they had hosted Thanksgiving dinners. These objects were no longer his. They were stage props for a play that had been canceled. In the kitchen, the marble island stretched out like a white altar. Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding band. It was a simple platinum band, scratched from years of drafting and site visits. He placed it in the center of the cold stone. Next to it, he placed a thick manila envelope. Inside were the divorce papers, signed and dated. He didn't write a long, emotional letter. There was no need to explain why the foundation had cracked. They both knew the ground had been shifting for a long time. Instead, he left a single sticky note on top of the envelope. I hope he is worth it. Lucas put on his coat. He took the handle of his suitcase. He walked to the door and paused, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant siren from the street below, the silence of a home that was now just a house. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway. He didn't slam it. He closed it gently, with a soft, final click. He didn't look back. Down in the lobby, the doorman nodded at him. "Heading out for the weekend, Mr. Bennett?" "Yes, Henry," Lucas said, stepping out into the gray New York afternoon. "I'm going away for a long time." Elena returned to the penthouse late Sunday evening. Her skin still hummed with the electric touch of Julian, a stark contrast to the quiet dread pooling in her stomach as the elevator ascended. She had rehearsed her lies in the cab ride over, complaints about a demanding client, a headache from too much screen time, the exhaustion of a work retreat. But when the elevator doors slid open directly into their foyer, the silence that greeted her was not the usual quiet of a Sunday night. It was absolute. It was the vacuum of a space that had been abandoned. "Lucas," she called out, dropping her keys in the bowl. The sound clattered loudly, jarring in the stillness. No answer. She walked into the living room. It was pristine. Too pristine. The throw blanket Lucas usually kept on the arm of the sofa was folded with military precision. The architectural magazines that usually cluttered the coffee table were gone. A cold draft swept through the room, though all the windows were closed. She moved to the kitchen, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. Then she saw it. The white marble island was empty except for two objects that caught the dim light of the stove hood: a platinum ring and a manila envelope. Elena froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. She approached the counter slowly, as if the objects were volatile explosives. She picked up the sticky note attached to the envelope. "I hope he is worth it." The handwriting was Lucas's, neat, blocky, architectural. The words hit her like a physical blow to the chest. He knew. He hadn't just suspected. He had known with enough certainty to dismantle their entire life in 48 hours. She ripped open the envelope. Divorce papers, signed. He hadn't asked for the apartment. He hadn't asked for spousal support. He hadn't asked for anything. He had simply erased himself. For a moment, panic flared, hot and suffocating. The shame of being caught. The terror of the unknown. But as she stared at the empty space where his espresso machine used to be, the panic began to curdle into something else, something lighter. She didn't have to confess. She didn't have to endure the screaming matches, the couples therapy, the tearful explanations to her parents. He had done the hard work for her. He had left. A strange, intoxicating sense of relief washed over her. She was the victim of abandonment now, technically. Or better yet, she was free. Free to be with Julian. Free from the suffocating safety of Lucas's love. She pulled out her phone and dialed Julian. He answered on the second ring, the background noise of a jazz bar filtering through. "He's gone," Elena whispered, her voice trembling, not with sorrow, but with adrenaline. "Lucas, he left. He knows everything." "Is he causing a scene?" Julian's voice was smooth, unbothered. "No, he just left. The papers are signed." "Well then," Julian said, the clink of ice against glass audible. "That simplifies things, doesn't it? Come over. Let's celebrate the first day of the rest of your life." Elena looked at the platinum ring on the counter one last time. It looked small and insignificant. She turned off the kitchen light, leaving the ring in the dark, and walked out the door. 3,000 miles away, in a rain-slicked motel parking lot just outside of Seattle, Lucas turned the ignition off. The engine of his rental car ticked as it cooled. The air here smelled of pine and damp earth, a world away from the metallic scent of New York. He didn't have a plan beyond tonight. He didn't have a home. He watched the rain distort the neon sign of the motel, blurring the red letters into bleeding streaks of light. He reached for his phone to check the time, and his thumb hovered over Elena's contact. Delete. He pressed the button. The contact vanished. It was the only violence he allowed himself. He grabbed his bag and stepped out into the rain, letting the cold water wash over him, beginning the slow, agonizing process of rebuilding a man from the rubble. 2 years had passed since the apartment in Manhattan fell silent. To the outside world, specifically the curated audience of Instagram and LinkedIn, Elena was thriving. She was the partner of Julian Thorne, a power couple featured in the society pages, dining at Le Bernardin and vacationing in the Maldives. But the reality of life with Julian was less a partnership and more a performance art piece. They were in the back of a town car, returning from a gallery opening in Chelsea. The city lights streaked across Julian's face, illuminating the sharp set of his jaw. He was scrolling through emails, the blue light of the phone screen reflecting in his eyes. "You laughed too loud at the curator's joke," Julian said. He didn't look up from his phone. His tone was casual, conversational, but it carried the weight of a reprimand. Elena stiffened, her hand tightening around her clutch. "It was a funny story, Julian." "It was a polite anecdote," he corrected, finally glancing at her. His eyes swept over her designer gown, not with admiration, but with the critical gaze of an appraiser checking for flaws. "When you laugh like that, you look eager. It diminishes your value. We are there to be intrigued, not entertained." A cold knot formed in Elena's throat. She turned her gaze out the window. In the past, with Lucas, laughter had been the currency of their marriage. Lucas used to recount his day just to see her eyes crinkle, to hear that uninhibited sound. Lucas had never asked her to shrink herself to fit into a room. "I'm sorry," she murmured. The apology tasted like ash. She had been apologizing a lot lately, for her opinions, for her schedule, for simply existing in a way that didn't perfectly complement Julian's brand. When they arrived at Julian's loft in Soho, an industrial, brutalist space that felt more like a museum than a home, Julian went straight to his office. "I have calls to Tokyo. Don't wait up." Elena was left alone in the expansive living room. The furniture was Italian, low profile and uncomfortable. There were no personal photos, no warmth, just expensive textures and vast, echoing space. She poured herself a glass of wine, her hands trembling slightly. The silence of the loft was different from the silence Lucas had left behind. That silence had been heavy with grief. This silence was sharp with neglect. She sat on the edge of the sofa and unlocked her phone. It was a ritual she had developed over the last 6 months, a secret habit she performed when the loneliness became suffocating. She opened the search bar. Her fingers hovered over the keypad before typing, "Lucas Bennett, architect." She hit enter. She expected to see news of his failure, or perhaps news of his success. Maybe a photo of him with someone else, something that would justify her choice, something that would prove he was just as flawed and replaceable as she felt right now. But the screen stared back with a maddening lack of information. There were old links to projects from 3 years ago, a mention in an architectural digest from before the divorce, but nothing recent. No LinkedIn updates, no Instagram profile, no website for a new firm. It was as if he had ceased to exist the moment he walked out of their door. She tried variations. Lucas Bennett, Seattle. Lucas Bennett, Design. L. Bennett. Nothing. He hadn't just left her. He had erased himself from the world she inhabited. He had built a wall so high and so thick that she couldn't even see a shadow of him. Elena stared at the phone until the screen dimmed and went black, reflecting her own tired face. A tear traced a hot path down her cheek. She wiped it away furiously. She had chosen this life. She had chosen the excitement, the power, the man who demanded perfection. But as she sat in the cold, beautiful loft, she realized with a terrifying clarity that she had traded a man who saw her for a man who only saw her reflection. And the one person who had truly known her was gone, leaving no footprints for her to follow. 5 years is a long time in the life of a city, but it is an even longer time in the life of a man. In Seattle, the rain fell differently than it did in New York. It wasn't a punishment. It was a rhythm, a constant, gentle percussion that washed the world clean. Lucas stood on the deck of his home on Bainbridge Island, watching the ferry cut a white wake across the gray waters of Puget Sound. He was 42 now. The hair at his temples had turned the color of steel, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, etched not by stress, but by the squinting focus of a man who spent his days looking at light and shadow. He was no longer just Lucas Bennett, the husband who stood in the corner at galas. Professionally, he was now known as L. Andrew. His firm, Sanctuary Design, had become a quiet phenomenon in the Pacific Northwest. He built homes that didn't just shelter people but healed them, structures of cedar and glass that forced their inhabitants to slow down and breathe. "The coffee is ready, Andrew." Lucas turned. Sophie, his business partner and the closest friend he had made in this new life, stood by the sliding glass door. She was a landscape architect with earth under her fingernails and a calmness that matched his own. Their relationship was undefined, a comfortable companionship that might one day become more, or might simply stay this warm, safe thing. Neither of them was in a rush. "Coming," Lucas said. He walked inside. The house smelled of roasted beans and damp pine. It was a space he had designed for himself, open, honest, with no hidden corners. He sat at the large oak table that served as their collaborative workspace. Sophie slid a thick portfolio toward him. "The mail came in," she said, tapping the cover. "This one is interesting. A blind query from a holding company in New York. They want to build a flagship headquarters, but they don't want a glass tower. They want, and I quote, a space that breathes." Lucas picked up the brief. New York. He hadn't been back in 5 years. He hadn't stepped foot on the East Coast since the morning he left his ring on the marble counter. For a long time, just the name of the city had been enough to trigger a physical ache in his chest, a phantom limb pain of a life amputated. But today, reading the words, he felt nothing but professional curiosity. The wound had scar tissue now. It was tough. "It's a big project," Lucas noted, flipping through the site specifications. "Why us? There are plenty of starchitects in Manhattan." "They specifically asked for the firm that designed the glass house in the woods," Sophie explained, referring to Lucas's award-winning project from last year. "They want the West Coast ethos. They want your silence, Andrew." Lucas ran his hand over the paper. The client was listed as Vanguard Holdings, generic, corporate. But the budget was limitless, and the artistic freedom promised was rare. "Do you feel ready to deal with New York energy again?" Sophie asked, watching him closely. She knew the broad strokes of his past, though not the details. She knew he had left a life behind, burned to the ground. Lucas looked out the window at the rain-soaked fir trees. He thought about the man he used to be, anxious, eager to please, constantly seeking validation from a woman who couldn't give it. That man was gone. The man sitting here was solid. He was built on a foundation of his own making. "I'm not afraid of the city, Sophie," Lucas said quietly. "It's just concrete and steel. It can't hurt me anymore." He picked up a pen and signed the intent to bid document. "Let's see what they want," he said. He didn't know that by signing his name, he was setting into motion a collision course with the past. He didn't know that Vanguard Holdings was the parent company of the venture capital firm Julian Thorne now ran. He simply drank his coffee, listened to the rain, and felt a dangerous, serene confidence that he was untouchable. The conference room at Vanguard Holdings was designed to intimidate. Located on the 60th floor, it was a fortress of polished granite and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying view of the Hudson River. Elena adjusted the collar of her blazer, checking her reflection in the dark glass of the window. She looked tired. Even the expensive concealer couldn't hide the shadows beneath her eyes, nor could the tailored suit disguise the thinness of her frame. 5 years with Julian had honed her image but hollowed out her spirit. "Stop fidgeting," Julian murmured, not looking up from his tablet. He sat at the head of the long table, drumming his fingers impatiently. "This architect, L. Andrew, is already 10 minutes early. I hate eager people. It smells of desperation." "He's on time, Julian." "We were late," Elena corrected softly. "Details," Julian waved a hand dismissively. "Let's just hope his designs are worth the retainer. I want a monument, Elena, something that screams legacy." The heavy oak doors opened. A young assistant stepped in, looking flustered. "Mr. Thorne, the principal architect is ready for you." Julian leaned back, crossing his arms. "Send him in." A man walked in. He was tall, wearing a charcoal suit that was clearly bespoke, but lacked the rigid structure of Wall Street fashion. He wore no tie. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a hint of tanned skin. His hair was cut short, peppered with salt and iron gray, and he wore a pair of thick-rimmed glasses that gave him an air of scholarly intensity. He carried a roll of blueprints under one arm and walked with a steady, grounded gait. He didn't look desperate. He looked like he owned the ground he walked on. Elena felt a strange, prickling sensation at the back of her neck. There was something about the way the man moved, a precise economic grace, that triggered a dormant memory deep in her limbic system. The man reached the end of the table and set the blueprints down. He didn't look at Elena. He looked directly at Julian. "Mr. Thorne," the man said. His voice was deeper than she remembered, roughened by age and perhaps by the sea air of the West Coast, but the timbre was unmistakable. "I'm Andrew. Thank you for having us." Elena's heart stopped. The room tilted. The air rushing into her lungs felt like broken glass. Lucas. It was impossible. The Lucas she remembered was softer, hesitant, a man who blended into the background. This man took up space. He radiated a quiet, formidable power. Julian, oblivious, stood up and extended a hand. He didn't recognize the man he had cuckolded 5 years ago. To Julian, Lucas had been a non-entity then, and he was a stranger now. "Andrew," Julian said smoothly, "I've heard great things about your work in Seattle. This is my partner, Elena Vance." Lucas finally turned his head. The movement was slow, deliberate. Behind the lenses of his glasses, his eyes were calm, terrifyingly calm. There was no flash of anger, no wideness of shock. It was the look one gives a stranger on a subway train, polite, acknowledging, and utterly indifferent. He looked at Elena. He took in the expensive clothes, the tension in her jaw, the fear in her eyes. Ms. Vance, Lucas said, nodding slightly. He didn't offer his hand. A pleasure. Elena opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream, to run, to fall to her knees, but she was frozen by the absolute wall of ice he had erected. "Shall we begin?" Lucas asked, turning his back to her to unroll the blueprints. "I believe the concept of sanctuary is what we are here to discuss, a place where one can find peace amidst the chaos." He began to speak about light, about structure, about honesty and materials. Julian was captivated, nodding along, completely unaware that the man pitching him a sanctuary was the same man whose sanctuary he had destroyed. Elena sat in silence, unable to breathe, realizing with a crushing weight that the man she had thrown away hadn't just survived. He had ascended. And looking at him now, she knew with a sickening certainty that he was no longer hers to hurt. The meeting adjourned with handshakes that felt too firm and smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Julian, distracted by a buzzing phone, clapped Lucas on the shoulder, a gesture of ownership over the talent he had just hired, and excused himself to take a call in the corridor. "Elena, wrap things up with Andrew, will you?" Julian threw over his shoulder, not waiting for a response. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving them alone in the vast, glass-walled room. The silence that descended was thick, pressurized, like the air before a thunderstorm. Lucas began gathering his blueprints, his movements methodical and calm. He didn't look at her. He seemed entirely focused on rolling the paper into a perfect cylinder. "Lucas," Elena said. Her voice cracked, a fragile sound against the corporate sterility of the room. He paused, his hand resting on the leather case of his drawings. He turned slowly. "It's Andrew now, mostly. But you can call me what you like, Mrs. Thorne." The name, Mrs. Thorne, hit her like a physical slap, though his tone was polite. It wasn't an insult. It was a fact, and that made it worse. "Please." She stepped closer, the smell of her expensive perfume warring with the scent of cedar that clung to him. "Don't look at me like I'm a stranger. It's been 5 years, but I'm still me." "Are you?" Lucas asked. He looked at her, really looked at her, studying her face with the detached curiosity of an architect inspecting a renovation that had gone wrong. "You look tired, Elena." The mask crumbled. Elena let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging. The poised PR executive vanished, replaced by a woman drowning in plain sight. "I made a mistake," she whispered, the words rushing out now that the dam had broken. "God, Lucas, I made such a huge mistake. It's all fake. The parties, the articles, Julian. He doesn't see me, he just sees an accessory." She took another step, reaching out as if to touch his arm, but his stillness stopped her. She dropped her hand. "I think about you," she confessed, tears welling in her eyes. "I think about the mornings in the kitchen, the quiet. I didn't know how much I needed the quiet until I lost it. I was a fool, Lucas. I was bored, and I mistook stability for stagnation." Lucas listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer a handkerchief. He stood like a statue, weathering the storm of her regret. "Why didn't you fight for me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a sudden desperate accusation. "Why did you just leave? No shouting, no argument. You just erased yourself. Did I mean so little to you?" Lucas finally moved. He took off his glasses and cleaned them with the edge of his shirt, a habit she remembered from a lifetime ago. When he put them back on, his eyes were clear and dry. "You didn't mean little to me, Elena. You meant everything," he said softly. "That's why I left." But if you loved me, you would have stayed to fight, she sobbed. No. Lucas shook his head gently. Fighting is for when there is something left to save. By the time I left, you had already been gone for months. I saw you with him at the gala that night. I saw the way you touched him. Elena went pale. I'm not angry that you fell out of love with me, Lucas continued, his voice steady, devoid of malice. People change. Hearts change. I could have forgiven that. He stepped closer, invading her space for the first time, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed louder than any scream. What I couldn't forgive, Elena, was the disrespect. You were planning a weekend with him while kissing me goodbye at the door. You were going to keep me as a safety net while you auditioned him. That wasn't a mistake. That was a calculation. Elena flinched. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you, Lucas said, picking up his case. I left because I finally started loving myself enough to know I deserved better than being your second choice. He turned to the door. Lucas, wait, she cried out. Can we? Is there any chance we can start over? I can leave him. I can fix this. Lucas stopped with his hand on the brass handle. He didn't turn back. Some structures, once the foundation is cracked, cannot be repaired, he said. They have to be condemned. Goodbye, Elena. He opened the door and walked out into the busy corridor, leaving her alone in the glass box she had fought so hard to enter. The elevator ride down to the lobby took 45 seconds. Lucas watched the floor numbers descend in digital red, each passing integer feeling like a layer of weight being shed from his shoulders. When he stepped out of the revolving doors and onto the pavement of 57th Street, the noise of New York City hit him, a cacophony of sirens, drilling, and impatient horns. 5 years ago, this noise had sounded like chaos. Today, it just sounded like a city he used to know. He didn't look back up at the glass tower. He didn't need to check if she was watching. The architecture of his past was finally dismantled. Up on the 60th floor, the silence in the conference room was broken by the return of Julian Thorne. He breezed in, thumbing a text message, bringing with him the frantic energy of the market. Did you get the contract signed? Julian asked, not looking at Elena's face. He walked over to the window, surveying his kingdom. Good guy, that Andrew. A bit dour, maybe, but he understands scale. He'll build us something magnificent. Elena stood by the mahogany table. Her hands were trembling, but she clasped them together tightly to hide it. She looked at Julian, the sharp profile, the expensive watch, the complete and utter lack of curiosity about her inner world. He's gone, Julian, she said softly. Of course he's gone. The meeting is over, Julian replied absently. He finally turned to her, frowning slightly. Why are you crying? Did he say something rude? No. Elena wiped her cheek, realizing with a sinking heart that she couldn't even explain it to him. Julian would never understand. He dealt in assets and acquisitions. He didn't understand the value of things that couldn't be bought. He was perfectly polite. Good. Fix your makeup, Elle. We have dinner with the investors at 8. Julian turned back to his phone. Elena walked to the window. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, looking down at the ants scurrying on the pavement below. Somewhere down there, Lucas was walking away. He was walking back to a life of cedar trees, rain, and honest work. A life where he was loved for who he was, not what he represented. She had the penthouse. She had the black card. She had the man everyone wanted. And as she stood in the climate-controlled air of the skyscraper, she realized she had never been colder in her life. She was trapped in the view, a permanent fixture in a beautiful, airless room. Down on the street, Lucas hailed a cab. LaGuardia Airport, he told the driver. He pulled out his phone. The screen was bright against the gray afternoon. He dialed a number he now knew by heart. "Hey," Sophie's voice answered on the first ring, warm and clear, carrying the ambient sound of rain in the background. How did it go? Was the city a monster? Lucas leaned back against the worn leather seat of the taxi. He watched the skyline of Manhattan begin to recede in the rear window. The Empire State Building, the Chrysler, the jagged teeth of the skyline that had once chewed him up. "The city is just a city, Sophie," Lucas said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in days. And the meeting, it went exactly how it needed to go. "Are you taking the job?" "No," Lucas said firmly. "I'm going to recommend a firm in Chicago. It's not for us. It's not for me." "Okay," Sophie said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. She didn't ask why. She trusted him. "When are you coming back?" "I'm on my way to the airport now," Lucas said. "Put the kettle on. I'm coming. Home." The taxi merged onto the bridge, crossing the water, leaving the island behind. Lucas closed his eyes and listened. He didn't hear the sirens anymore. He only heard the sound of moving forward,